So thanks for joining me today, Matt. I wonder if you can give a bit of a background on who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure, Ben. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you. I know we've been connected for a very long time, so nice to chat virtually with you here. So just a little about me. I'm an engineering professor out of the University of Colorado in the US. So maybe a non-traditional safety kind of background in engineering. And I run a research group at the university called the Construction Safety Research Alliance, and that group does research directly with industry. So we've got at any given time about 300 people across the industry that do work with us. And so it's kind of exciting to work with the people that actually have to go deploy the knowledge. So that's been the last 6, 7 years of my life in summary.
I ask this with everyone, but what is safety?
I think everybody has their own pet definition of safety. I'll answer actually, but with a bit of a preamble to my answer. We did a study a few years ago where we asked hundreds of people what their definition of safety is, because I thought, at least our team thought, nobody really owns a definition of safety, and we were curious what it meant across the field. And not surprisingly, a lot of folks saying, safety is the presence of safeguards or the presence of capacity. I'll give you my definition in like real energy speak, because that's what I work in most. But that is, we need energy to do work. The college physics textbook definition of energy is the ability to do work. So we need it to move things, cut things, lift things, and we need a lot of energy to get the job done. So my favorite definition of it within an engineering sense is safety is our ability to harness that energy to get work done without that energy coming in contact with the human body, because it's energy transfer from the environment to the body that causes physical damage or injury. So that's my favorite definition.
Does it change the way that you actually do safety work, this definition?
I think I can really speak from the academic side of things. The way that we measure safety oftentimes directly reflects what we think safety is. And so I think if we can add precision around the definition of what safety is, it allows us to observe the world in a more structured way. And so for a lot of the experiments that we run and large, data collection efforts that we deploy, having a good, precise definition that kind of aligns with our vision of, what safety is, enables us to go and try to observe things and measure things in a more precise way and consistent from site to site. So I think it does direct, what we say safety is, shows our values and priorities, and then starts to align our way we observe and measure and what we're trying to improve. So I think it's probably the definition of safety, one of the most foundational things that we do as a profession, whether we're academics or practitioners. We got to look at what are we trying to do? What does it mean to us? And it can have a softer sense to it or a harder sense to it, and neither is right or wrong. I don't think anybody can claim that they have the definition of safety, because there are many floating out there, and good ones at that.
Next question. Are there really no meaningful links between the causes of minor incidents and SIFs?
Oh, that's a good question. I think what we found statistically is that if you look at really large data sets, there is no statistical relationship between more severe injuries and less severe injuries in terms of their occurrence or their frequency. I know that there are older studies out there that show almost an inverse relationship between the two, but I think in modern day safety, we have the benefit, at least in North America, of having a really large data set of a few trillion worker hours of representation, and we didn't find any links. And so the old way of thinking, based on pyramids and ratios of deal with the bottom, you get to the top, that seems to be false given the nature of the data. But so is the narrative that companies with a higher recordable injury rate will have a lower SIF rate or something like that appears to be untrue also. So it's kind of unsatisfying. There seems to be no relationship, not a convenient one either way or the other, at least according to our data sets. But in terms of the causal factors, what's interesting I find is the hazards that cause the more serious incidents tend to be quite a bit different than the hazards that tend to cause lower severity incidents. But there are some factors that contribute to all types of incidents. For example, fatigue or distraction or other kind of human factors. Whether we're fatigued and we trip over our own shoelaces, or we're fatigued and get too close to a piece of heavy mobile equipment, fatigue's a contributor to both of those kinds. So I wouldn't say that they're completely separated in terms of their causal factors, but certainly not tied together so closely that we can find a formal relationship between the high and the low severity. So I think it's complicated, actually. It's not a good soundbite, if that makes sense. It's got some complexity to it, I think.
If you had access to, let's say, 2 or 3 times of that data set, do you think you would have found a relationship? Like, do you think it's more a product of the statistics, or is it just not there?
I think once you get up into looking at, 100 plus companies, the large companies doing a lot of work, we might find it. Our data doesn't represent smaller organizations. It doesn't represent less mature organizations. So, all of what I'm saying is kind of with the caveat in terms of generalizability that it really applies to large, mature organizations in North America, right? Because that's who we have access to. I don't think adding more data once we get to this point would reveal a relationship unless it was an extraordinarily weak signal. And at that stage, if it's extraordinarily weak, it probably doesn't matter in practice, right? If there was a strong relationship, we would have found it straight away. I think more data would only reveal that there's a tiny, connection, even if there is one. So I'd say probably doesn't matter if we have more data for that one.
How should industry respond to your findings that SIFs seem to stem often from missing controls and planning failures and not human error?
I really like the question because it points to something that may be a little less intended, if you will. So what we're finding is that many of the serious injuries have some exposure to an uncontrolled high energy source, some significant hazard. But it's important to remember that every control is designed, installed, verified, and used by people. And so if we do have an error, however we define error to be, or some deviation from what our desired outcome is, we could end up having an exposure, a missing control because of some planning or execution error. So I think that both are highly relevant, both the energy and its control, but ensuring that we have people set up for success and their ability to install those controls and use them in a continuous way, et cetera. So I think human error is still part of it.
Do you think that this whole focus around having controls that are, in a sense, immune from human error doesn't really reflect modern construction? I
think that what it does is it highlights where our biggest gaps are. So, one of the things that I'm proud that we've been able to really uncover with some precision and objectivity is where some of the biggest exposures lie. I'll give you an example. You have an employee working around heavy mobile equipment, yellow steel as we call it. There are many work scenarios where even the most mature companies don't have hard physical barriers between the people and the equipment operator. And what we're relying on is, their ability to not make a mistake at the same time. And if that's the only, safeguard truly, then we're setting ourselves up for, failure. It's not, humans are high performance, but they're highly variable. So yes, I think what you're saying is, spot on. We're trying to port something from a more controlled environment to a much more dynamic and transient environment. But I think that's okay because what it's doing is it's pointing out where our gaps are and the fact that, look, that might be harder to manage, but we should still, aspire to manage it at the same level. And that might take more innovation and more time and more technology and more creativity to make it work.
Yeah, so you're not arguing that we need valve levels of reliability with people and avoiding human error. We just need to move towards that sort of waypoint.
Yeah, I think of them like stepping stones. I mean, where we are right now is I say the royal we're relying on people executing perfectly for a lot of things, whether they're spotters or flaggers or equipment operators or employees who are working in, particular configurations. We're still relying too much on, people trying to be perfect. And I think, what some of these frameworks do is they guide us towards thinking about how could we get to higher order of controls and where should we put our resources. We need to be creative and we need to, lobby these, suppliers and manufacturers to do new things. This gives us some, ways of working collectively to give advice or make requests to those groups about what we need to control better. The
next question's around indicators and measurement. So if some of these common measurements like TRIFR, LTIFR, et cetera, are statistically meaningless, at least from the use cases that you presented in your report, for predicting SIFs. What should we be measuring instead of those sort of measures?
It's the $1 million question. I do a lot of speaking in board meetings nowadays, and they want to hear about the company wants me to tell them that recordable injury rate's terrible, and of course the first question that the board members come back with is, okay, now what am I going to do? I advocate for not just throwing lagging indicators away and saying, don't do lagging, do leading, or something along those lines. I think what we need to be better at is moving towards a set of metrics, and I mean a set of metrics that give us information that better explain why we get our long-term lagging indicators that we get. So, TRIFR or TRIR is invalid over short periods, but if you roll averages and you take enough time and, aggregate the data to a level, the trends can have some meaning to them. And I think what we need to do is have some other measures that are more leading or monitoring sense that help us explain the ups and downs. Because I think a lot of executives kid themselves if they can explain the small ups and downs they have in their recordable injury rates. We can explain our way through anything given the data, but whether those explanations are true or not is suspect. So I think I'd look at a balanced way. So I'm kind of giving you a non-answer. A good question. We've been working on it. So things like measuring the quality of our activities in the presence of controls, but there is no form, response where we have something that's working right now that everybody can use and it's standardized and benchmarkable and all of that. There's work to be done in that space. And
I think there's something here worth flagging is I've seen some of the straw man arguments around your report and the language you use around the statistical invalidity of TRIR. But that's not actually what you argued. You argued it's about the use cases, how organizations are using them. They have little or no statistical validity for those. So you weren't making a broad, absolute statement that they have no validity at all. Yeah, I mean, if you're using it, we tend to use our metrics in a comparative sense. So in particular, when we make something into a rate, the only thing we're really doing, the only reason we make something into a rate is so we can compare it, whether it's you and I have a company, we compare time to time, or us to other companies, or whatever it may be, it's comparative. And what we argue in the paper is if you're using that number to make comparisons over too short of a time frame, those comparisons don't have statistical meaning that we sometimes assign to them. It's not to say that the measurement itself is inherently bad. It's how we use it that's bad. And if you had 50 million worker hours, then the number probably means something. But if you've got 500,000 hours and you're selecting contractors based on that, we might not be making the best business choice with that information. How should we interpret decades of research and benchmarking that has relied on TRIR and similar measures? Yeah, so as soon as we published that paper, the academic community around us sort of freaked out and they said, does that mean that everything that used recordable injury rate as a dependent variable is now meaningless? And what we found in the paper is that there's a lot of noise. So it's very, rare and random these events are, but not perfectly so. There's some signal in there. It's just, only about 2%. So what that actually means is that studies that have good studies, I'll preface that, good studies that have shown relationships among factors and recordable injury rate, for example, were able to find a relationship between the variable, whatever it may be that they were studying, and that small signal in that noisy variable. So in a way, it's counterintuitive. It may show that some of those studies had, possibly more validity or more, that's the wrong way of putting it, a stronger relationship between the variable and safety may have existed than was detectable with recordable injury rate. So it doesn't mean that all that stuff's invalid. We probably could find better variables that, aren't as rare and random, but it means that those studies may be stronger than we thought in a counterintuitive way. We discussed before around measuring different sorts of input measures, and like Deming and the quality movement were talking about doing that same thing in the 50s and even earlier. Is that what a better indicator program looks like, do you think, measuring the inputs? Yeah, I think so, as long as we know that the inputs relate to the outputs.
I mean, after all this stuff and the work that we've done and everything, looking at lagging indicators and saying how bad they are, the reality is we still want to prevent people from being seriously injured on job sites. So what I tend to think about nowadays is, look, we need metrics that are aligned with our goals. So if we say preventing or eliminating serious injury is the goal, then whatever the measurement is needs to be aligned with that goal. If we say we want to use it for comparison, we better be able to standardize it and use it consistently across companies, right? It needs to have a clear direction. We want it to go up or we want it to go down. And it needs to be stable and meaningful over the period that we report it at. So the things that I'm most excited about are things that we can monitor over time. So things like, we really can measure, do we have direct controls, using my own speak, direct controls for the high energy hazards in the work environment? And that's accessible and measurable. So are the quality of the activities we do, like our leadership engagements, our safety walks, our pre-start meetings. If we care about the quality of those activities, that's what we should be measuring. But it's easier said than done, having metrics in particular that are standardized, because everybody wants to just go do their own thing. And that's fine if you want to use the measurement only in your company, but you get up to the board level and the C-suite and everybody else who has to look across companies, and those metrics, they start to lose interest in them, as they should, because that's their job, is to look at how the company fits in the grander scheme of things. So I think we got our work cut out for us to standardize and compromise, and I'm optimistic that we can get there, but it's going to be hard work.
I really want to move on to your SIF stuff, so I'm just going to ask one last question around the injury measures. Sure. Now, you know this as well as anybody, many organizations are still coupled or connected to these. We still have to report them. What do you think is a better use case for these sorts of measures?
Let's say your company has to report recordable injury. I'll take almost every contractor in the world. You'd be failing an IQ test if you're like, I'm not going to measure recordable injury rate. If your clients want it, you're going to have to give it to them. So I think what I would suggest is in the short term, while the community is working on better metrics, use them over longer periods. So don't just report it month to month or something like that. You can roll your averages, which consume more data in each one of those data points, and convert us from thinking about a month to month number difference to the trend, and it smooths it out a little bit, just like we'd look at the economy in a different way. And that would be my first take. The other thing you can do is you can severity weight some of those metrics. So if you've got a 2-stitch cut to the finger and a fatality being counted equally in the metric itself, it's a little off, right? Or maybe a lot off. And so there are ways to weight them, roll the averages, and some good literature out there to lean on for how to do that.
All right, cool. What factors predict the use of higher order risk controls?
Yeah, so we're actually working on a project on that right now. We're calling it the Energy-Based Risk Assessment Project, where we're looking at what predicts, control presence in the field. And one of my former PhD students, Alif, studied this. There are some pretty strong signals out there for situations that don't have good control of the energy. Work situations where we have a lot of schedule pressure, that leads to, cutting corners and, doing things, being rushed and doing things a little more quickly. There's a big one in terms of being able to not identify every single change that's going to happen, but organizations and crews that know how to, deal with the dynamic nature of work. There's also competency around being able to recognize hazards, in particular critical hazards. That's a kind of an assumed skill that people think everybody has, but we have pretty big gaps. And so those types of strengths show us strengths in the controls, and then they also, the opposite's true, the weaknesses. And I think that the strongest factor of them all is whether or not we're having really good planning and coordination just before the job begins, right? So that's been the strongest signal in the research so far, is that planning for the work as we're imagining it will be, and how we're going to deal with changes. That's the driver of good control during work.
You also found that the crew familiarity or the supervisor familiarity or the foreman familiarity. Can you talk about that one briefly?
Yeah, so it's familiarity with each other and among the crew members, and it's also familiarity of the crew with their work. So the work configuration itself. Both of those had some driving force towards good control. Crew familiarity with each other tends to be uniformly positive, more familiarity being better. People's familiarity with their work, however, is a bit more complicated. So if you're really and you don't know what you're looking at, that's not so good because you don't know what controls need to be in place and there might be, complexity to it. But on the other end, if you're very, very, very familiar with the work, you may be normalized against the risk and too comfortable and tend to drift towards, being closer to the energy or, being able to work really, really quickly without a control in place. So it's a bit of a bathtub curve as we've seen in factors before. So familiarity with the work has a bit of complexity. We want to be kind of in that thick middle, and the extremes tend to be problematic.
What do you think are some of the biggest gaps in our understanding of SIF prevention that need to be filled?
All right, I got my number one thing, and that's human ability to anticipate and notice change, evaluate that change, and make good decisions with change. For ages, even when I was working, 25 years ago, people, the boss will say, plan for change and stop work when something changes. So that's nice to say, but stuff's constantly changing in my environment. And noticing when those critical changes have happened. I have a new high energy hazard, or I have a missing control because of some change that's happened. There's literature out there that shows that nearly half of the serious injuries, fatalities, have some last minute change associated with them. And, the literature is really thin. So, my colleague Sid, he's working on this project now, along with one of the best psychologists in the world. And so, I'm confident we'll make some progress, but I think that's pretty virgin territory and a really big gap. So I'm both scared of it and very excited to be working in that space. And I encourage others to look into it as well, because pretty rich opportunity for good research if somebody can get it right.
What upstream design or planning interventions have you seen that are more effective for reducing SIF potential?
Yeah. So, the highest order controls that we can put in place are going to help us to eliminate the energy human interaction, or reducing the amount of energy. Both of those types of controls are predominantly things that we put in place during design. So if we're going to, it has to be the way we've envisioned work, and whether it's happening at the design of the product or the design of the process. I think it's a really important area. Socially and politically and economically, that's a really challenging thing to do, this design for safety. In Australia, you all have legislation that helps, point people in that direction. And so does the UK with the CDM regulations. But here, stateside, OSHA puts the responsibility on the employer, which is generally the contractor. And so that's pretty distant from the designer in many, many contractual relationships. So all to say, I think there's pretty clear understanding that that's where the biggest impact can be. But actually making that happen requires a whole lot of education, requires, incentives that don't exist naturally, perhaps in regular contracts to actually, and in competencies, as I said, letting designers know what those energy sources are and how they'll be used. So I think it's an area where we need to make more progress, and it's a tough area to work in, I think.
Yeah, it's a great point around putting the onus of responsibility onto the subcontractors. Actually, Jan Hayes' work and others, they've spoken about risk shifting and how we essentially, they say crap rolls down hills, and we effectively put the onus onto those who have the least resources to actually mitigate the issues. So I think sort of ties into your argument.
Absolutely. A principle of good risk management is that the person who owns and manages and mitigates the risk is the one that has the greatest influence on it. So any contract that has that backwards is a bad contract, right? And just objectively. And I think that's kind of what we've done through the legislation, as many of the hazards that emerge have to be managed and, by the people who were very distant from the decision that was made that put that hazard there in the first place. Closing that gap requires a whole lot, at least here where I live, is a lot of political and legislative change would be required to close that gap. But good clients are coming about and really funding those types of activities, and that's a positive change. They're doing that for good business and ethical reasons.
So this question kind of flows on, I think, from the prior questions, particularly around change and managing change. Do you think that there's sort of these new view philosophies, particularly focusing on daily work and variability, align really well with your high energy control approach?
I think so. I'm a consumer of that philosophy. I wouldn't consider myself much of a philosopher myself, but if you think about our ability to be resilient and responsive to change in the dynamic nature of work. I think that's where things get spicy and interesting is how to do that. So, the energy framework, I think, offers some precision around, what is our objective? What are we aspiring to have in terms of a level of control? And then can serve as some guardrails in terms of, defining what variability is. We have to have, again, variability is against some baseline expectation. So I think it can add some precision to how we're assessing variability, what variability means to the frontline employee. And then, in research, we can start studying that a little bit better to find, where are we drifting? Where do some of these changes happen in a more discrete fashion? And so I think they're like many things, if you get down to the essence of what that philosophy is and what energy-based safety is trying to achieve, it's the same goal. One explains why and how, and the other explains what you do. And I think if you link them all together, they're certainly not opposing.